We are tired of being in this dispersion, as the song states, and we wait for your calling to bring us home to Jerusalem to proclaim your name on your Temple Mount when Yeshua sits there. But we also know, Yahweh, the reality of the matter is that there's much work that still has to be done in each and every one of us, inside of us, individually and collectively. Help us all, Yahweh, to submit ourselves to you and to the power of your word and to the power of your spirit to help weed out of us, Abba, all the corruption and the wrong attitudes and the anger and the bitterness and the resentment and the unforgiveness and the spirit of malice and wrong doctrine and all of these things, Abba, that we may come to a complete person in Yeshua as he works through us, Abba. Help us with our frailties and our weaknesses. Help us with our lack of faith. Help us with our inability to be able to see as clearly as Yeshua can see the beginning from the end from the very beginning. We don't know what lies in front of us the next moment, Abba, but you do. And we don't have tomorrow promised to us. So help us to learn how to take each and every day and to honor that day with you in our lives, doing everything that you could possibly want us to do, so that we can stand before you if tomorrow doesn't come on that great day, Abba, when you resurrect us into spirit and we stand before your throne and you can judge us and say, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the kingdom. It is for this, Abba, that we look forward to. This is our hope. This is our joy. This is everything in our being that we are waiting for. But now, Yahweh, that is far off. But right now, help us to take as much pleasure and as much joy as possible in the work that you're doing in us right now. There'll never be another moment like there is right now. This moment is unique in itself, and there'll be another moment never again like this moment. So help us to seize this moment in what you're doing with us, Abba, both the good and the not so pleasant, because even the things that are not so pleasant, if we take it patiently, are commendable before your sight. And this you take great joy and delight in our pain and our trials and our sufferings. Help us, Abba. Each and every one of us is going through individually difficult times. And we pray, Abba, that you will help the body of Messiah to get through their individual problems as well as the collective unit. So we just want to thank you, and we invite your spirit to be here today, Abba, to have your way with us. Help us to hear from your spirit what you are saying to us as you instruct us in these end times. So we just want to bless you and thank you for this great day, this Sabbath day that you have set aside for us that marks your people. In the name of Yeshua HaMashiach, Amen. Well, we went through the book of Galatians, and I hope for those of you who are here, I hope that you were able to glean a lot of interesting stuff from there that opens up the scriptures much more than it ever has before, because I know it has for me, because now I look at scriptures very much differently than I did in the past, because I see who the players are in the book of Galatians. And so I was praying about what to go into next, and I meandered around a bit and prayed about, and I decided I think Colossians would be a good book to try to go through. In many ways, we'll discover that the same problems that the Galatians had, the Colossians had as well. And I don't think it was to maybe the same degree of problems that the Galatians had, but it was unique unto their own particular situation. And so, like with all the messages that I give them with twofold points. And that is, one is that we need to be able to understand the underlying tone of what is going on in that particular book, so that whoever the writer is, in this case being Shaul, we will be able to understand the complexities of the issues he had to deal with, the nature of the people he had to deal with, and where he was trying to take them from and where he's trying to bring them to. The other aspect, and I think is equally as important, is how is this relevant for us today? There are a lot of spiritual messages in these things here. There's a lot of lessons to be learned, because there's nothing new under the sun, as Solomon says. And so whatever they were facing back then, we can find those same kinds of unclean spirits that have our society today. They may be wrapped a little bit differently, they may be presented slightly differently, but at the end of the day, the purpose and the design of those unclean spirits is to do exactly the same thing to us as it did to them back then. And as we've been seeing more and more reports of people who are mainly coming out of the Christian church into the Hebraic roots of the faith, are finding themselves in a lot of problems because they're coming into a world that is vast. Vast in the sense that we have people who've been around a long time teaching in the Hebraic roots. Most of them tend to be Messianic Judaism in nature, which, you know, I love my Jewish brothers. I'm a Jew myself, but I have a lot of issues with Messianic Judaism because Messianic Judaism tends, for the most part, not all of them, I want to qualify that, but for the most part, tend to emphasize rabbinics. And they tend to emphasize Talmudic Judaism. And as we went through the book of Galatians, I showed why Talmud and Rabbinic Judaism is the covenant of Hagar, and we need to be extremely careful about what we accept as doctrine, particularly when it comes from the philosophies of men. Well, the Colossians had their own issues with mainly what I'll call probably the house of Shammai and the subgroup of Pharisees that came under the influence of the house of Shammai, which they were very strict and very legalistic. And very possibly, as we talked about, the Ebionites probably had their influence with the Colossians as well. But we'll get into that stuff a couple weeks down the road. And so, coming back again to what I was saying is that it's extremely important that we try to understand what kind of unclean spirits were influencing these people of their day. Because we will find that in our society today, we have the same kind of oppressions that are coming at us, just packaged a little bit differently. And so it's my hope and my desire and my passion that as we go through this systematically, we'll begin to unravel and begin to see those unclean spirits and bring them out for what they are so that we can be on guard. Because there are so many that are falling away from the faith. They're renouncing Yeshua. And they're going back into Talmudic Judaism or Rabbinic Judaism and completely renouncing Yeshua. And this ought not be. And I can't help but to wonder if we're not really beginning to enter into the times of what is called the Great Falling Away. And the Great Falling Away is the falling away from Torah or from moral principles. And it's interesting because the scriptures state that the revealing of the son of perdition or the revealing of the anti-Messiah will not occur until the great falling away comes first. It also says that that which restrains will continue to restrain until that which restrains is removed out of the way. And then that's when the son of the man of perdition or the beast or the lawless one, you know, there are like 7 different titles you can attribute to this man, he won't be revealed until that which restrains is removed out of the way. Well, what is restraining is Torah, because Torah stands for morality. As long as the nations have some certain level of morality, there's a certain level of stability. It's kind of like, well, in this fellowship, if we all pursue morality of Torah in our dealings with one another, we'll have stability. But if all of us decide, you know, Roosevelt's going to kind of take this way out and go deal with a person this way, and Mandy's going to deal with another person another way that's anti-Torah, we're going to have so much division and confusion in here that this will all be gone in a heartbeat. Well, nations are that way. As long as nations have a certain level of morality, which is based on Torah, not man's philosophies, then the world has a certain level of stability and peace. And so that which restrains is the Torah. As long as there's a certain level of morality in the world, the man of sin stays in hiding. He is not revealed yet. But once the nations start to indulge in iniquity and in sin and in transgressing against moral law, and I'm not even talking about the first 4 commandments about your relationship with Yahweh. I'm just talking about human to human, the last 6 commandments. When they start stealing from each other, when they start lying to each other, when they're committing more adultery, sexual immorality, when they're bearing false witness against their neighbor, when that gets to a certain point, the plug starts to get pulled on society worldwide, and then the nations begin to go into turmoil and collapse. When they start to go into turmoil and collapse is when that which restrains now is removed out of the way, which is Torah. Then the man of sin is revealed. And he's ready to come and pick up his harvest, because he's got a whole bunch of people who are into lawlessness and rebellion, and that's exactly who this guy is waiting for. So Yeshua is waiting for his harvest, which is us, the first fruits, but the man of sin, who is the incarnate of Satan, is waiting for his harvest, which is the rebellious ones. And so we're seeing in the society and the world today where things are systematically breaking down and falling apart within governments. And I don't really blame the governments per se, because governments only fall apart when the level of morality of its citizens is an all-time low. And so it creates a vacuum, and unclean spirits come in, and they fill up, and they give you these wicked leaders who come in and begin to oppress the people. That's just a universal rule throughout Scripture from Genesis all the way to Revelation. So, like Paul and all the other apostles, they all had to constantly be battling with different groups that were coming in, trying to oppress their the first century believers and get them to sway away and go into false doctrines of demons. And so with the Colossians, it was no different. So anyway, let's start off here. And there's a little bit of a map here that shows, and I'll point to it right here. This is where Colossae is, just so you know. This is the country of Turkey. And if it's interesting, if you look at the book of Revelation in chapter 2 and chapter 3, pretty much all the churches Yeshua speaks to is right here. This is the area. You got Ephesus, you got Smyrna, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, Pergamum. You know, you got them. They're all right in here. This is mainly the area. So I just want to put that map there so you have a point of reference for what's going on. Okay, so today what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into a little bit of a couple of different things. I'm going to go into a little bit of the history of the area, a little bit of the history of the people, and I'm going to go into a little bit of the history of the book of Colossians itself, who's the player of the book of Colossians. And I think that'll pretty much cover most of what I'm going to deal with today. And then next week, well, not next week, because Mandy is actually going to be giving something that she wants to share next week. But the week after, I'll actually get back to reading. But I feel that this is really important to try to understand what Colossae was, how it came about, and some of the issues that caused them to be what they were. So the mission work in Colossae was done by a man named Epaphras. Paul called him his dear fellow servant. Epaphras had probably gone to Ephesus, where he had heard the gospel of Yeshua from Shaul. Afterwards, he returned to his home in Colossae to start a congregation there. He likely did so under Shaul's guidance. The church of Colossae appears to have consisted of mostly Gentile or Ephraimite converts, as well as those of the circumcision. The reason why I say that is because this area here, as I had talked about in Galatians when I laid down the history of that, we saw that the way that the Galatian area came into being was the inhabitants of that city were descendants of the Scottish. And I went through a little bit of the history showing that the Galts were Hebraic in origin, and that when the northern 10 tribes went into dispersion, they went all the way up into Scotland, and then those in the Galatian area had brought them as mercenaries down into the Galatian area, and they helped fight the locals at the time and overthrew and then took over the area. But in essence, they were Hebraic. They were the northern 10 tribes of Israel, and they had settled in the Galatian area, and that's who the people were. Remember, Yeshua says, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He said that he only came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So it only makes sense that the apostles went out, particularly Paul, went out to reclaim the akrabousia in the Greek, which is the tossed away foreskin ones. That's a reference to the northern 10 tribes who look like Gentiles, and were living like Gentiles, but in their genetics or in their bloodline, they were really Hebraic. They were the 12 tribes of Israel, or Ephraim, as we want to generalize that. Converts, as well as those of the circumcision. So we also had Jews, and the reason why I show in a minute is that this was a trade route. There's a river that went through all this region. It was a trade route, and all kinds of merchandising was done. And wherever you find trade routes, you're going to find Jews. Because they like money, they like to trade, they like to do business, and they're all up through there. So you had those of the circumcision who believed in Yeshua were mixed in amongst them. Philemon was one of its members to whom Paul wrote the letter we now know as the book of Philemon. The letter to the Colossians, like the letter to the Romans, was a letter addressed to a congregation which Shaul had not established himself. I found that to be interesting that Shaul didn't actually go down there and establish it himself, but as read earlier, Epaphras probably heard one of Paul's messages in another city and was so inspired that he went back to Colossae and started his own congregation and basically was kind of like an elder. Generally, it was elders who ran the local congregations. The letter to Colossians, like the letter to the Romans, was a letter addressed to a congregation which Shaul had not established himself. Most of the members were known to Paul, as it appears from Colossians chapter 2, verse 1, in which he wrote, I want you to know how great a struggle I am having for your sake, and for those in Laodicea, and for all who have not seen me personally. So this is kind of a little bit of a piece of evidence that goes to show that Shaul himself had not actually been there. Yet Shaul enjoyed a close connection with the church in Colossae, which was located in the same Roman province as Asia, in which Ephesus was the capital where Shaul had labored for more than 2 years. People from the entire area came to hear Shaul, no doubt from Colossae as well. Furthermore, those who worked with Shaul, as well as those who were converted by Shaul's preaching, carried the gospel of Yeshua to the entire area. For we find this in Acts chapter 19, verse 10. It states, Now this happened for 2 years, with the result that all who lived in Asia heard the word of the Master, both Jews and Greeks. So again, here's another little bit of a hint that Jews and Greeks were there. And I failed to mention, but we did have some Greeks that came over into the area of Colossae as well. So let's move on. Let's take a look at the city of Colossae a little bit here. Colossae was a city of southwestern Phrygia in the Roman province of Asia Minor in what is now Turkey. The city was situated on the Lycus River, not far from where the river joined the Meander River. Colossae was located about 125 miles east of Ephesus, near the cities of Hierapolis and Laodicea. These two cities were 10 and 13 miles respectively northwest of Colossae, which was the oldest of the three cities. So in some of these cities, when Shaul had to travel through this region to speak to the congregation, some of them weren't that far apart, but they were certainly seen to all be within about 150 miles as far as from north to south. Originally, Colossae lay on the trade route from west to east. This location made it an important city. But then the main road was changed and moved north near Hierapolis and Laodicea. So we begin to see a little bit of a change in the topography and the location of these areas. These two cities then grew in importance and surpassed Colossae in wealth and in prestige. I want you to note wealth and prestige, because I believe it ties into another message which I'll deal with here in a little bit. Colossae declined to a relatively small, unimportant village. So that's where it wind up going later on. It retained its fame for its wool and its municipal independence under the Romans. Epaphras, ethnicity, and hometown. The name Epaphras is a shortened form of the name Epaphroditus, not the female. This is the male. The meaning of which is handsome or charming, by which our brother Roosevelt is sometimes referred to. He's handsome, charming man. The Epaphras mentioned in Colossians and Philemon should not be associated with or confused with the Epaphroditus mentioned in Philippians chapter 4, verse 18. So apparently there was another man that had the same name. When Shaul and Timothy penned the epistle to the Colossians at about AD 62, that's about the time that this book was written, they gave 4 descriptions of Epaphras. He is first called our dear fellow servant. He is also called a faithful minister of the Messiah. The third designation is a bond servant. And finally, my Shaul's fellow prisoner in Messiah Yeshua, which is found in Philemon chapter, that wouldn't be right, chapter 23. That's a typo. I'm not sure why that's there like that. But anyway, it's found in the book of Philemon. Twice Epaphras is described as a servant or a slave. The emphasis of this word seems to be on the relationship between the slave and his master. So let's take a little bit of some lessons here from history so we can get a little more clarity about the area of Colossae. The city lived its heydays during the Persian rule in Asia Minor between the 6th and 4th centuries BC, respectively, but lost its importance after the foundation of Hierapolis and Laodicea around the 2nd century BC. So we can see clearly over a couple of centuries it begins to decline downwards. Then the city was developed together with Laodicea. So we begin to see an emergence, a conglomeration of two different towns that are only a couple miles apart coming together and merging more into one. I want you to notice that because I think that's important. In wool production and weaving until it was destroyed by a major earthquake in the 1st century AD during the reign of Nero. During the late Roman period, Colossae was diminished into a village status due to the immigration to the Hierapolis and Laodicean cities. So here is the two coming together and it's merging as one. Finally, the city was abandoned completely at around century AD. And to this day, there's nothing there except for ruins. So eventually, the point here is it came to nothing. It completely fizzled out. And Laodicea actually is the one that really kind of took it over. And it merged and then took it over and replaced it. So let's take a look here. Laodicea is an ancient city located in the Lycus River Valley of Anatolia near Hierapolis and Colossae in Denizli province. It was founded in the 3rd century BC by Seleucid king Antiochus II in honor of his wife Laodice. The city was in Phrygia, bordering with Caria, and hold an important location at the valley, which was a natural caravan trade route from the Aegean Sea to inland or vice versa. Therefore, it prospered throughout the centuries. Since Colossae was absorbed by Laodicea, it basically took its place. Perhaps this is why we do not find Yeshua addressing Colossae directly in the book of Revelation, but Laodicea instead. I had never thought about that. Why is Colossae not part of the 7 different congregations? And we got to remember now that when Paul's writing to Colossae, it's around the early 60s AD. But when the book of Revelation was written, it was written around 95 AD, some 30 or so years, 40 years later, 35 years later, something like that. So apparently, there was more of a shift of a downward part of Colossae into transforming itself and being taken over and replaced by Laodicea. So that may explain why Colossae was not mentioned in the book of Revelation as a correction and also an admonition as the rest of them were. So let's take a look here in Revelation chapter 3, verse 17, because Yeshua brings out a couple of points that I think is important that may explain at least a little bit of possibly where the problem was. It says in verse 17, because you say I am rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing, of no employment. Remember, this was a prosperous area. They had a trade route on the Lycus River, and they traded in wool and in weaving, and they were extremely wealthy people. They did very, very well. So it's a very prosperous area. So this seems to make a little more sense as to why he's bringing this out in the book of Revelation. And do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor as a beggar, blind and naked. Verse 18, I counsel you to buy, redeem from the marketplace from me gold refined to the point of glowing. It's not just enough to be gold, but gold that is glowing. And gold that is glowing is gold that is on fire. It's gold that's in a fire, and it's in a liquid form. It can be molded into any shape that it wants because it's pliable, and it can be used by the goldsmith to make whatever he wants. So this is what it's trying to convey in the Greek. That you may be rich with inner and outer clothing. Inner and outer clothing, and white garments, which stands for righteousness or purity, that you may be clothed, that the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed. And anoint, that is, rub into your eye with eye salve, that you may be able to see. I'm bringing this out because it seems as if that part of their problem, and I've seen it today, and I've even had it happen to myself. There's times over the years when I prospered really, really well. And I did well in business, and I got lazy, and I thought I was riding high on the waves of this earth, and I was doing good, and nothing could touch me, and then I got brought down. And it's a very, very dangerous state of mind to get into. Just because Yahweh's blessing you doesn't mean you should put your trust and confidence in your employment or in your money or the things that you possess or anything like that. And this seemed to be a weak spiritual character that these Colossae or Laodiceans seemed to have, and it was causing them a problem because they were getting into a spirit of complacency. And that's where wealth can get you in this world if you don't keep it in check and keep it in balance. So when I was talking about earlier about what lessons can we learn from what these people have gone through and how do we apply it today, that is for each and every one of us to measure to ourselves as we introspect and look within ourselves to see what particular issues that we're dealing with. Since Colossae was heavily dependent on wool as its trade and was a major trade source that brought them great wealth, is why Yeshua warns this region of their spiritual state. Apparently they did not heed, and that was that city finally was destroyed. So with all the preaching that Paul did to Colossae, I forget how many years it was, maybe 20 or 30 years later, a great earthquake took place and it destroyed Colossae completely. But it was already in transition at that point and being consumed by Laodicea. So let's take a look here, the Pope and the Sabbath. It really shouldn't be the Pope and the Sabbath, but some people write it that way. It's really the Council of Laodicea. So this is interesting because we all know about the Council of Laodicea. But Laodicea is what we're kind of talking about here, not only in the book of Revelation, but in regards to Colossae, or what Colossae actually became as it was swallowed up by Laodicea. And so what we have here in AD 364 as the exact place and time where the Sabbath was changed. Oftentimes I've seen brothers and sisters over the years, when they come into the faith and they keep the Sabbath, then what happens is their work starts getting in their way. And it may be that the boss is putting pressure on them, that they have to work on the Sabbath, they're going to lose their job. So they begin to compromise with the Sabbath, and they'll work one Sabbath, and then they don't work a couple other Sabbaths, then they go back and work again. And eventually what happens, I find, with those people is they usually wind up going all the way out. Because you can't serve two masters. You either love one or you hate the other. And so is it possible, with all the wealth and with all the prosperity that they were getting, I know it's in a certain way it's kind of tempting, not tempting, I don't want to use that word. The evil solicitation, I'll say, on me many times is I have so much work that if I did go in on Sabbath and I worked during the Sabbath, I could bring in quite a bit of extra money. But I have to make a conscious decision that I'm not going to do that. That work will have to wait till tomorrow, the first day of the week, and I'll get to it then. And I'll deal with it the other 6 days of the week, and I'm just not going to do that. It comes down, at the end of the day, it comes down to a quality decision. What kind of a quality decision are we going to make? And so many don't make a quality decision, and they allow their boss or their employer to get up underneath their skin and cause them the spirit of fear that they're going to lose their job, instead of putting their trust and confidence in Yahweh, that, you know what, if that boss, and Sharon's going through that right now. We prayed about her situation a week ago because her employer was giving her a rough time. And at the end of the day, what it comes down to, and she's totally sold on it, that is, if it's meant for her to stay at that job, then the employer is going to change their attitude, right? And if the employer is not going to change their attitude, that means that door is closing and another door is opening, and Sharon's going to go through that door. And that's what happened. So after we prayed about it, she got a solid word this week, that the employer's going to want her to move on, and so that's what she's going to do. So now she's just going to discover what is the new door that I go through. And that's life walking with Yeshua and with Yahweh. Things change. So is it possible that with all the prosperity that they began to compromise maybe with the Sabbath and some of the other things of Torah, and therefore this area became ground zero, so to speak, of where the Sabbath would be attacked that would affect the rest of mankind through history up until the time that Yeshua returns. The 29th canon of that council reads thus: Christians ought to not Judaize and to rest on the Sabbath, but to work that day, but preferring the Lord's day, should rest, if possible, as Christians. Wherefore, if they shall be found to Judaize, in other words, resting on the Sabbath, let them be accursed from the Messiah. So that was the decree that they had made. And we suffer that up till today. You know, Yeshua says, hold what you have until I return. Hold what you have. In other words, when you're called out of this world, you're coming from a curse into a covenant of blessing. And as you leave the curse behind and you cross over, that's what Hebrew means, or Hebraic means to cross over. You're basically crossing over from your wilderness over your Jordan River into a promised land. And when you do that, Yahweh in your life begins to give you ground. And that's what Yeshua is talking about. Hold your ground. Hold that which you have until I return. So, for example, if you're having a problem in your marriage when you are in the world, and then you cross over and you come to Messiah Yeshua, from that moment, Yeshua begins to work out a plan in your relationship to repair the breach, to fix what's wrong, to change the heart in the marriage, or anything else. It could be finance, it could be anything. It could be personal things going on with inside your character flaws, moral issues, whatever it might be. And so what happens is, every day, you get a little more ground on the positive side, on the covenant side, on the side of blessing, on the promised land side. And every day that you encroach into that land and you gather more land, your job and your responsibility is to hold on to that and dominate that, so that the enemy cannot come in like it happened so many times with Israel. When Israel began to fall away from the faith, then the Assyrians would come in, or the Canaanites would come in, or Hittites, or the Jebusites, and all these other ites would come in and try to take over the land and encroach into their territory and steal it away from them. So our job is to occupy until Yeshua comes. Whatever he gives us, whatever we wind up winning back from the enemy on this side of the river, that's what we're supposed to hold on to. That's why Scripture says Yahweh takes no pleasure in those who draw back. Because the day you start to draw back is the day that the enemy begins to take over. So we can never, ever, ever get complacent and allowing the enemy to come in and start taking over, where we start feeling sorry for ourselves, that we're not what we think we are in Yeshua, that I can't seem to get anything right. Nothing seems to work out for me. Everything seems to go wrong. I pray, and I pray, and still nothing seems to change. Well, maybe with your eyes in the natural realm, you can't see what's going on in the spirit realm. But that's where the real movement is. And that's part of the point of what I'm trying to bring out here today in the lessons in this, is that what are the unclean spirits trying to do to us today? Because Scripture tells us that we're not supposed to be ignorant of Satan's devices. That means we need to be able to study how unclean spirits function. What legal rights do they have, or do we give them when we pull back? What legal right do we give them to come into our life and take over that particular area of our life? I'm not talking about losing your salvation. I'm just talking about whatever gains you made in that area, what do you wind up losing because you give them the legal right by default to come in and take over. So let's move on here. So could it be that the final straw that Yeshua warned the Laodiceans about? So much emphasis on work and making money, which so oftentimes puts the Sabbath on the back burner, which is the sign that marks his people, and now been replaced by the sign of Tammuz, or Sunday. if this congregation would have held fast to the Sabbath, perhaps the Council of Laodicea would not have taken place there, but somewhere else. The question is, the thing that I ask is, why did the devil pick Laodicea to establish this route? It's kind of like when the Muslims on 9/11 they hit New York City. Why did they establish a mosque at ground zero? And the reason is it's a legal maneuver. Because what they are saying is, we dominated this piece of ground. So legally, we own this ground. We may not actually inhabit it right now, but we're staking claim. It's kind of like you see the old Indian movies where a chief Indian comes out on a horse and he takes his spear and he shoves it into the ground. And he's making a defiant statement. I own this. You come past this line, I'm taking your head off and I'm going to scalp you. And so when the Muslims hit on 9/11, they put a mosque there. It's their dogma that when they put a mosque there, that means we stake claim to this ground. We may not have full, complete dominance over it yet, but we have a foothold. And matter of fact, I think a few days ago I heard that ISIS has made a statement that soon the flag of Islam will be flying over the White House. Yep. Now, the United States has given legal jurisdiction for this to take place. So my question is, if that is the case, and that's how things all work in our lives, when you give a legal jurisdiction for an enemy to come in and begin to take your ground away from you that rightly belongs to you, that Yeshua gave to you, and that you're supposed to conquer through faith and following him, how did this Laodicea get picked to be the place where the Sabbath was going to be directly attacked, and we feel it to today? Did the Laodiceans fizzle out? Or not the Colossians, I'm saying. Did they fizzle out? Maybe their city fizzled out because they began to compromise too much, which is Paul's admonitions against them, as we'll read in the coming weeks. It's a question. I pose the question for thought, because this is an exercise in discerning spiritual legalities of the unclean spirit world. That's what I'm trying to get across. And the enemy cannot do anything to you unless he has a legal right to do so. I've had to cast spirits out of people, and the only way that those spirits got into those people is because they had a legal right to be there. When I find out what the legal right is, I wipe out the legal right by the blood of Yeshua, and they have to leave and they can't come back unless the person of his own free will decides to go back and indulge in that practice again. Then that would be an exception to the rule. So everything's about legalities. That's what the Torah is all about. That's why it's important for us to understand the Torah so that we can understand what our legal rights are. Pressure from imperial cults to conform. I don't know if you ever heard the concept of imperial cults, but this is imperial cults. I'll read a definition here just a little bit. The imperial cult is the cult based on the worship of inferior of mankind as master, defender and father of mankind, developed following his interment in the golden throne. Heresy against it is punished severely. The religion is administered by the ecclesiarchy, which is the control of government by clerics or by proxies. The imperial cult is the imperium state religion, and in many ways the religion is the state itself. We are dangerously now on the precipice of this ourselves in this country. I'll show in a minute. It binds humanity together in the service of the emperor and imperium. The imperial creed is highly reflexible, and it's tailored by missionaries to fit the narrative of the culture, religion, and practices of whatever world it exists upon relative to that particular society. So as we know, with Constantine, what he did was he told all the different cultures and different religions of his day, because there were many in Rome, and he said, just bring your deities with you, and we'll incorporate it all into one universal religion, which became Catholicism, official state religion. So you don't have to give up. You think just come in and conform to what we're saying, but use your deity in that conformment. And then no opposition. And I'm going to show in a few minutes here, the same thing is happening to us now. And a lot of us don't even realize it's being done. So let's move on. However, the ecclesiarchy does enforce basic key tenets. And here they are. The emperor once walked among men, but he is and always has been an Elohim. That's how they view themselves. They're arrogant. The emperor is the one true Elohim, regardless of what past base and human may have worshipped. Now, it's important. What I'm going to show you in a minute is we're seeing the genesis of this taking effect in this country. Right under the nose of everybody. We're being conditioned, subliminally conditioned to start falling into place. Every human being has a place within the emperor's divine order. Isn't that comforting? To unquestionably obey the authority of the imperial government and one's superiors. What we have to keep in mind is government is a philosophy of men and by men administered by unclean spirits. Yeshua says, my kingdom is not of this world. In no way, shape, or form are we supposed to entangle ourselves into the political system of this world. Because then what happens is you try to serve two masters at the same time and it won't work. And you're going to be put in a position where you're going to have to choose one or the other. Imperial cults of the day. At the end of the 1st century, Christianity under the Roman Empire in Western Anatolia was an illegal sect. This is part of what the Colossians were having to deal with, as well as the Laodiceans and the Ephesians and so forth. Its members acknowledged the sole sovereignty of Elohim, of Yahweh. This put them in direct conflict with the sovereign claims of the state and the cult emperor worship. Christians are critical of the status quo and rejected the popular mores and customs. They were required by the state to conform to the laws, but they held that their religious standards superseded state law. Therefore, the government considered them traitors, and when they persisted in their defiance, punished them with death. And you can find that in Edmund's Turkey's religious sites on page 62. Who is the imperial cult leader that is threatening us for us today that shows these signs that we should take note of? Barack Obama. Now, I want to clarify what I'm saying. I'm not picking on Barack Obama. I don't care if you're a liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, independent, socialist, communist. I don't care who you are. Because as far as I'm concerned, all those guys are all in the same boat. They're all part of the same problem. So it's just that one guy's the figurehead, but there's other guys beyond him that are really the problem. But the real problem is the people of the country. Because I think, like in Colossae, their moral standards began to drop. And as their moral standards began to drop, their country began to implode in on them, and then they began to be taken over by another area, another city, which was Laodicea, which, as we saw, Yeshua didn't have too many kind things to say to them. And so, what I want to do is I want to show a video here. It's about 9 minutes, and I want you to listen to what we're being told politely right now, what is expected of us. And it's extremely creative, and it's hard to fight against, certainly in the natural realm, and it's spiritual legality. And if you subscribe to this, you're in big trouble. So let's watch. This was in 2006.
And moreover, given the increasing diversity of America's populations, the dangers of sectarianism are greater than ever. Whatever we once were, we are no longer a Christian nation, at least not just. We are also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, and a Buddhist nation, and a Hindu nation, and a nation of non-believers. And even if we did have only Christians in our midst, if we expelled every non-Christian from the United States of America, whose Christianity would we teach in the schools? Would it be James Dobson's or Al Sharpton's? Which passages of Scripture should guide our public policy? Should we go with Leviticus, which suggests slavery is okay, and that eating shellfish is an abomination? Or we could go with Deuteronomy, which suggests stoning your child if he strays from the faith? Or should we just stick to the Sermon on the Mount, a passage that is so radical that it's doubtful that our own Defense Department would survive its application? So before we get carried away, let's read our Bibles now. Folks haven't been reading their Bible. Which brings me to my second point. Democracy demands that the religiously motivated translate their concerns into universal rather than religion-specific values. What do I mean by this? It requires that their proposals be subject to argument and amenable to reason. Now, I may be opposed to abortion for religious reasons, to take one example, but if I seek to pass a law banning the practice, I can't simply point to the teachings of my church or evoke God's will. I have to explain why abortion violates some principle that is accessible to people of all faiths, including those with no faith at all. Now, this is going to be difficult for some who believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, as many evangelicals do. But in a pluralistic society, we have no choice. Politics depends on our ability to persuade each other of common aims based on a common reality. It involves compromise, the art of what's possible. And at some fundamental level, religion doesn't allow for compromise. It's the art of the impossible. If God's spoken, then followers are expected to live up to God's edicts, regardless of the consequences. Now, to base one's own life on such uncompromising commitments may be sublime, but to base our policy making on such commitments would be a dangerous thing. And if you doubt that, let me just give you an example. We all know the story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham's ordered by God to offer up his only son. Without argument, he takes Isaac up to the mountaintop, he binds them to the altar, raises his knife, prepares to act as God commanded. Now, we know things worked out. You know, God sends down an angel to intercede at the very last minute. Abraham passes God's test of devotion. But it's fair to say that if any of us leaving this church saw Abraham on the roof of a building raising his knife, we would, at the very least, call the police and expect the Department of Children and Family Services to take Isaac away from Abraham. We would do so because we don't hear what Abraham hears. We don't see what Abraham sees, true as those experiences may be. And so the best we can do is act in accordance with those things that we all see and that we all hear, be it common laws or basic reason. Finally, any reconciliation between faith and democratic pluralism requires some sense of proportion, and this goes for both sides. Even those who claim the Bible's inerrancy make distinctions between scriptural edicts, sensing that some passages, the Ten Commandments, say, or the belief in Christ's divinity, are central to the Christian faith, while others are more culturally specific and may be modified to accommodate for modern life. And the American people intuitively understand this, which is why the majority of Catholics practice birth control and some of those opposed to gay marriage nevertheless are opposed to a constitutional amendment to ban it. Religious leadership needs to understand they don't have to accept such wisdom in counseling their flocks, but they should recognize this wisdom in their politics. Now, a sense of proportion should also guide those who police the boundaries between church and state. Not every mention of God in the public is a breach of the wall of separation. Context matters. Now, it's doubtful that children reciting the Pledge of Allegiance are feeling pledged or brainwashed as a consequence of muttering the phrase under God. I didn't. Most of the time when they're saying it, they don't even say all the words. You know, they're just kind of, it's all running into, yeah, they're sleepy. You know, having voluntary student prayer groups use school property to meet should not be a threat any more than use by the high school Republicans or some other political group should threaten those with differing views. You know, one can envision certain faith-based programs targeting ex-offenders or substance abusers that offer a uniquely powerful way of solving problems. So we have some work to do here, but I am hopeful that we can bridge the gap that exists and overcome the prejudices that all of us to one degree or another bring to this debate. And I have faith that millions of believing Americans want that to happen. No matter how religious they may be or may not be, people are tired of seeing faith used as a tool of attack. They don't want faith used to belittle or to divide. They are tired of people who deliver more screed than sermon, because in the end that's not how they think about faith in their own lives. So let me end with just one other interaction I had during my campaign. A few days after I won the Democratic nomination in my U.S. Senate race, I get this email from a doctor at the University of Chicago Medical School, and the email said the following, quote, "Congratulations on your overwhelming and inspiring primary win. I was happy to vote for you, and I will tell you that I am seriously considering voting for you in the general election. I write to express my concerns that may, in the end, prevent me from supporting you." The doctor then described himself.
This goes into another video, so we don't need to get into that part.
It's amazing what he was mentioning is on Buzz English.
What I want to say is that what's being proposed to us is right now very subtle, and it's very almost it's being done politely, and that's how it always starts. But then it gets ratcheted up when you don't conform. And as I was reading about the Colossians, who were having problems with their emperor worships that they had over there, they didn't take kindly to it. This is a video I saw several years ago. It goes back to 2006, before he was even a president, before he was even nominated, actually. And what's interesting is I went and I looked for every video on this presentation that I could find. I could not find the part I was looking for, because every one of them had it snipped out. That's the part you didn't get to see. And I wish I had downloaded it at the time, but I cannot find it anywhere. I mean, I spent an hour and a half this morning going through every one of them I could find, watching them over and over again, and you can see where they clipped the scenes and they edited out various parts of things that he said. But I'm going to tell you what he said after this one statement that he made about the Abraham thing. He says, and I'm kind of paraphrasing because I don't have the video clip to copy it exactly, but he says here, "I am going to pass laws that will come into direct conflict with your religious beliefs, and you will have to choose which side you will be on." Now, this is like a 45, 50-minute speech he gave. And he went, if you watch the whole thing, and you can't see the whole thing because they cut out some key parts like this because it didn't look very good. And he even talks about things that he had on his website that he had on there that people were taking up issue with. And when he went back and he looked at it, he had to remove it out of there and rephrase it because it was too in your face. And he mentions that in the video. They left that part in there. I didn't play that part. But what he said here is after this, I didn't put it in here, but what he said after this is, if you decide to stay on the hardcore side where you're not going to give in and come over to our side, you're basically going to be like on our blacklist. This, my brothers and sisters, is the beginning of imperial cult worship. This is what we got going on right now. It's being done very softly, very subtly, very politely. And I'm talking about all the politicians, because they all have this basic attitude that they own you and they're going to do whatever they want. They don't have your best interest in mind. And so what I'm saying is we have to be careful that the same kinds of things that happened to Laodicea and Colossae doesn't happen to us. I think we have all this stuff preserved in Scripture for our admonition for today. So if we'll take the time and really examine what's going on, what spiritual conditions existed at the time, and how does that relate to my life today, and should I be on the lookout for these things? If I am looking out for them, I'll be able to begin to see it. And it's kind of like you see a storm on the horizon. If you look up and see that storm and see that the winds are beginning to blow in your direction, you can prepare. But if you turn around and look the other way and just pretend that there is no storm, you're going to get carried up away in a whirlwind. And I don't think Yeshua wants us to pretend that there is no storm on the horizon. I think in our heart of hearts, in our soul of souls, we all know what is on the horizon. But the details of it are beginning to come out more and more. And the more that you can understand what's going on, as I'm trying to understand, the more we can be prepared for it and not be overcome by it when it actually starts to happen. And therefore be able to take the correct course of action and follow Yeshua in whatever direction he wants to take us. So with that said, that's the end of this basic intro to Colossae. I hope it gives a little bit of an understanding of the history of how it came about, and maybe some of the spiritual conditions that existed at the time that caused them to diminish in the size of their city and eventually get wiped out and consumed by Laodicea. And hopefully whatever Yeshua is saying to Laodicea may be the continuing spiritual issues of what that area had, and that because they didn't overcome it, what's that? See what? Oh, this one. Yeah. So anyway, with that said, that's the end of this part. Then we'll actually start getting into the actual chapter 1 and breaking that down and see if we can start discovering some of these different clues that are in the text itself in 2 weeks.